Um, Good afternoon if you're here on the Pacific or Atlantic coast. My name is Bima. I am the manager of East West, and I am here today with Charles B. Jones, and we'll be talking about his new book, as well as the event that he's doing with us later this month. Just to start with, I wanted to introduce you, Charles, before we start talking. Dr. Charles B. Jones is a professor at the School of Theology and Religious Studies at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. He focuses on East Asian Buddhism, and he's published History of Buddhism in Taiwan, Gentry Buddhism in the late Ming Dynasty, Jesuit missions in China, and Pure Land Buddhism, and that is the subject of the latest book here, Pure Land, and the subtitle, History, Tradition, and Practice. We'll be doing an event with him. I believe it's on June 17th, and if you look at the description on this video, you'll see a link to that, as well as you can choose to attend the event and buy the book, or just the event, or just the book, whichever one you want to do. But Charles, thank you for being here with us today.
It's my pleasure.
So I wanted to start with you just maybe telling us a little bit about yourself before we get into the topic. How did you grow up? Did you grow up in a eclectic spiritual family, or is this something that you arrived at on your own?
I grew up in a military family back in the 60s and 70s, which meant we moved around a lot. And my church life was basically whoever happened to be the Protestant chaplain on whatever military base we were living in. And sometimes church would be held in something that doubled as a movie theater on Saturday nights. I would have to say my own spiritual background is pretty strict Scottish Calvinism, which means I know exactly what the Protestant work ethic is. It is just burned right into my soul. But I always had a real interest in other people's religion too. And one of the clear memories I have is living at Myrtle Beach Air Force Base. And one day when I was about 10 years old, I just wandered up the street, knocked on a random door. And when the man answered, I said I wanted to come in and talk with them about their religion. So he invited me in, and his whole family gathered around. And
Really?
We had a nice conversation for about an hour.
What was their religion? Just
they were
to ask.
Catholic.
Okay.
And I'm not sure how I handled myself. My memory's a little fuzzy on the details of the conversation. But and then as far as getting into Asian religions, I think that goes back to one day in Kentucky when I picked up a hitchhiker who turned out to be a Sikh. And he ended up spending the night with me in my dorm room. We just talked all night. He left me some literature, and I thought, well, this is all very interesting. This is very different from anything I've ever run into before. And so I started reading at that point. So I would be maybe 22, 23 years old around this time. And then I just did a number of things. I was a street musician for a while. I was a disc jockey on the radio for a while. Back when country music in the United States was at its absolute nadir. And worked in an organic food store for a while, did construction, and finally went to work at the Duke University Library doing catalog data input. And right about that time, I decided I needed to really start thinking about something to do with my life. And I knew I had been reading about religion a lot. So I said, well, I'm very interested in that, obviously. So I signed up and went to seminary at the Duke University Divinity School.
Oh, wow.
And might well have ended up as a scholar of Old Testament or something at this point, except that I ran into and got to know Dr. Roger Corliss, who was a professor of religious studies at Duke at that time. And he and I met when I picked up a book of his at random at the Regulator bookstore on 9th Street, which was right next to the Duke campus. And it was actually on Christian spirituality. And I read it and I liked it. And then I went back and I saw another book and I bought it. And at that point, I read the back flap and thought, oh, this guy's at Duke University. He's just right here in town. So I wrote him a letter because we didn't have email then. And said, I read your book, I liked it. And a few days later, my phone rang. And probably this is going to be an embarrassing story I'm about to tell on myself. Those who knew Professor Corliss knew that he had a very bad stammer and it was hard to control. Mm. So my phone rang and I picked it up and I only heard somebody going, and I thought it was one of my college buddies pranking me. So I said something smart alecky and hung up the phone. And then the phone rang again. And he said, "This is Professor Roger Corliss." And I said, "Oh my gosh, I am so sorry." But we made arrangements to go have lunch together. And not long after that, we both joined a Renaissance choral group that Duke University ran that was for both what's called town and gown. And after that, we started just going after every Monday night rehearsal over to the East Campus Coffee House and just sitting and talking together. And even later after that, he ended up buying a house about 3 doors down from mine. And I ended up doing some construction work for him. So he specialized in Chinese Buddhism. And over the course of about 7 years of these conversations, he gave me a really good foundation. He convinced me that even at my relatively advanced age, I could learn Chinese. And when I finally decided, yeah, I'd kind of like to do this for a living, I of course asked, should I stay here and study with you at Duke? Because I knew him already, I already lived there. And he said, actually, no. He said, you need to go to the University of Virginia and you need to study with Paul Groner because he'll really train you right. And they've got many more resources up there. So he helped me to make the arrangements. I put in the application. The people at UVA made it very clear that they wouldn't even look at my application unless I'd already made a start in some Asian language. So I immediately signed up for Chinese down the road at UNC Chapel Hill. Had a very good Chinese teacher down there and just fell in love with the language. So I'm about 30 years old at this time. So the rest is been the course of a career that I found very rewarding. I finished up a PhD at the UVA in 1996. My dissertation was the history of Buddhism in Taiwan. I lived in Taiwan for 2.5 years while researching that. And what happened while I was there was because of a contact that my dissertation advisor had in Taiwan. He was an academic, but he was also a Buddhist monk, and he was the vice abbot of a temple that specialized in Pure Land practice. So through that, I started, going down the road. I got on the bus every Sunday afternoon and went down to the town of Sanxia. It was about an 1.5-hour ride down there. I got off at an intersection, walked about another half hour to get to the temple, and just started hanging out there pretty much every weekend. And I watched their activities, and while I had learned about Pure Land Buddhism during my graduate program, it occurred to me that what I was seeing there was absolutely nothing like what I'd learned. And it turned out the reason for that was all of the research on Pure Land Buddhism that had ever been done by Western scholars was based on Japanese scholarship. Back when I was in graduate school in the early 1990s, what people said was that the Japanese were the great scholars. There were no real good Chinese scholars to consult. And so what we typically did was learn to read classical Chinese for the Buddhist scriptures, but Japanese to read the scholarship. So I studied Japanese and got reading proficiency in that. But I was so in love with Chinese that I learned that enough to be fluent and polished it during my time in Taiwan. What that meant, though, was that even the research that was being consulted on Chinese Pure Land Buddhism was all being done through a Japanese lens. And the Japanese tended to see the Chinese Pure Land schools as precursors to the Japanese schools. And so they tended to interpret everything that happened in Chinese through that lens and not look at anything that happened beyond about the 10th century, because after that, Pure Land wasn't being imported from China to Japan anymore, and it went its own way. So after I wrote my dissertation and then got a job at Catholic University and revised my dissertation into my first book, I decided I would start looking at Chinese Pure Land Buddhism. basically ignoring the Japanese scholarship for the time being and just going straight into the sources. So I did a series of articles after that, and I've made many trips back to Taiwan and mainland China and had a chance to speak to a lot of scholars there who study it from their own perspective. Out of all that, it took about 20 years, but in 2019, I published a book specifically on Chinese Pure Land Buddhism. It was the first book that had ever been done on that topic,
Wow.
despite the fact that China is where it was born. That's the source, but nobody had really thought to really dig into it and look at it before. So after that, looking for something else to do, a good friend of mine from the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley said, well, Shambhala is looking for somebody to do a general introduction to Pure Land Buddhism because there really isn't one for an English-speaking audience. So I, during the book exhibition at a major conference, I went and made an appointment, saw the editor at Shambhala, and she said, oh yeah, we really need somebody to do this. So I took on that project. At the same time that I had a contract for another book. So for about a year, I was working on 2 books at once.
Oh, God.
Don't ever really want to do that again. But the result was the book that's now out from Shambhala called Pure Land History, Tradition, Practice, which I'm quite proud to say is the first book in English for a general audience on the topic.
That's brilliant. So what is it about?
Your question.
Yeah. You covered a lot there. What is it about? One of the things I was curious about, because the only awareness I had really about Pure Land Buddhism was, one, customers would come in and say, do you have any books on Pure Land Buddhism? Which was interesting. And then I would see it, in the Wikipedia kind of rabbit hole, you'd be looking at Mahayana and then there would be a sub note. And so what is it about Pure Land Buddhism, one, that drew you into studying it, and two, with this book for us lay people, what do you think it's important about it?
Okay, well, your last question is the easiest one to answer. What's important about it? It is the predominant form of Buddhism in all of East Asia. If you travel around China, Japan, Korea, almost any Buddhist you meet is going to be practicing Pure Land. It's so prevalent there that it's been incorporated into the very identity as a Buddhist. And I'm going to, do a little show and tell here. You've probably seen Buddhists in the US that will have one of these around their wrists, right? Little rosary. Well, or they might have something, the traditional 108 bead rosary. These are primarily used in East Asia for Pure Land practice. And it's what they use also as a marker of Buddhism. I also noticed that when you're at a temple or when lay Buddhists are interacting with each other as Buddhists, right? They're at the meeting of their local Buddhist association or they're at a temple event, they don't say hello, goodbye, or any other of the usual pleasantries. They substitute the name of Amitabha Buddha. So the temple that I hung out with, when they answered the phone, they answered it by saying Omitofo, Chinese for Amitabha Buddha. So it's massively important if you want to understand East Asian Buddhism. Now, the fascination it had for me was, it was a challenge. It was an unplowed field. It was a place where very few scholars had gone. I like to tell people, that in the West, for the most part, the big 3 forms of Buddhism that most Westerners have been interested are Zen, Tibetan, and Theravada. Mm-hmm. If you go into my office, I would guess between 8 and 10 linear feet of bookshelf space taken up with books on Zen by Westerners. So a lot of people have been very focused on Zen, but nobody had really done Chinese Pure Land. So for the attraction for me, just as an academic, was the opportunity just to open up a new field.
Sure.
And try to get other people interested in it. There was a real chance to, do something significant there. Mm-hmm. But on a more personal level, I think what I like about Pure Land is it just had a harder time of it, even in East Asia. a lot of Westerners have never heard of Pure Land, but when they have, they generally, at least until recently, haven't thought very much of it. They think of Buddhism as, self-help, as you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you learn the philosophy, you do the practice, you're working. And there hasn't been much room in the Western imagination for a kind of more salvific form of Buddhism. But the problem with any religion like that is it tends to leave out 99% of the population. It's when it's a heroic struggle that requires great austerities and a lot of intelligence and a lot of leisure to do some very complex practices, it's going to leave out a lot of people. And Pure Land was East Asia's answer to this. And what I found, especially in China, that I found so fascinating was that even there was pushback against it. The thought that all you have to do is just repeat the name of this Buddha several times, and when you die, he will come to your deathbed and just get you and take you to this paradise. Right? That it sounds kind of un-Buddhist, and that was true not only here in the West, but there was a lot of pushback in China. And one of the things I spent some time researching was how Pure Land in China defended itself against attacks. But the way it defended itself, I found very interesting. It built on very standard traditional Buddhist concepts. Like when a Buddha purifies his mind, that means his environment is pure as well. So the idea that the Buddha occupies a pure land is really nothing strange. The idea of transferring merit is already there. And even in forms of Buddhism like Tibetan Tantric Buddhism that Westerners may be a little more familiar with, the idea is still very firmly implanted there that Buddhas and Bodhisattvas will support you.
Yeah.
They will give you some of the merit that they've accrued through their training and their practice. So none of this is very strange. And the idea that you might chant something, a mantra or a dharani, is also just standard Buddhism. So Pure Land isn't as great a leap as people think. Mm-hmm. And I liked that when you looked at the Chinese material, you found in many cases, and I named 2 specific cases in the book, of Zen masters who had their big enlightenment experience when they were young. They went to the monastery, they studied, they worked hard, they had the experience, it was certified by their Zen master. They got their certificate, and they were then eligible to hold administrative positions in monasteries within their master's lineage, which is one of the purposes of getting enlightened in East Asia.
To get a job.
That's it. It's kind of like the PhD diploma I have hanging on my wall. It's an entree into a niche job market. Right. Westerners have not always understood just what enlightenment was for, thinking it's just some big experience that's going to make everything right in their life and fix everything. But these Zen masters then went to work. They got in administrative positions. And as the years go by, they're now in their 60s. Their teeth hurt, their back hurts. They have to meet with donors. They have to fix the leaky roof. They have to deal with the 2 novices who got into a brawl in the dorm last night. And the enlightenment experience they had is at that point in their lives kind of a distant memory. And they don't have the energy for that kind of practice anymore. And they turn to Pure Land. In their later years, they decide, hey, it's okay to ask for help. And so they start calling on the name of Amitabha. And the other interesting thing I found was if you look at the late Ming Dynasty, the late 1500s, early 1600s, when there was a real spike in interest in Buddhism among the educated classes in China, you find movements in Zen that look exactly like the beats of the 1950s and 60s. Intellectuals who love to have discussions of Zen thought and Zen philosophy and swap stories while they're drinking wine and going out. And one figure I've studied in some depth is so much like a Ming Dynasty version of Gary Snyder that it's almost frightening. But he wrote this very long defense of Pure Land. And the question he put to all of his Zen friends who wanted to talk against Pure Land was, he said, you're really kind of overrating yourself. You think you understand the highest principles of Zen. You think you understand total non-duality of things like purity and impurity and this land and that land, and the mind is inherently pure and all that. And he puts out this challenge. He says, look, if you're so enlightened and you really understand all that, do something for me. Jump in that latrine over there and swim around for a while. Get in bed with a leper and spend the night. And then come back and tell me how much you were able to dig the inherent purity of these experiences. And he says, if you find you can't do that, then you may need Pure Land practice to help you. You will call the name of Amitabha. He'll take you to that Pure Land, which is not like the Christian heaven. The Pure Land is a total immersion training ground. It's the ideal place to practice. It's a place where there are no distractions. There's a Buddha right there to answer all your questions. Everything you need is provided. I say it's like, getting a free ride to go to Michael Jordan's basketball camp, where you can stay there as long as it takes to become an NBA quality player, instead of shooting hoops in the dirt of your backyard with a homemade hoop and and a deflated ball. It's the ideal place. And he said, once you're there, you will attain enlightenment. And at that point, you'll be able to look back on your life here, and you'll know that there really was no difference between purity and impurity and this land and other lands and Buddhas and worldlings. But you're not there yet. And the Buddha has, paved this road for you to travel that'll get you right where you need to go. Why not take advantage of it? Mm-hmm. So I really like the way the practice really took root. It presented hope for ordinary people who really were realistically never going to meditate 10 hours a day, understand the highest levels of Buddhist philosophy. It gave them a way to get there by bypassing wherever their karma would take them in their next life to a place where they had an actual chance of attaining Buddhahood. And at that point, then, you're supposed to leave the Pure Land as a Buddha and start helping other sentient beings. So, it involves the aspiration to get this done, get to the Pure Land. That's your quickest path to Buddhahood. And if you're serious about the Mahayana vow you took, that you want to get to be a Buddha so you can help other sentient beings, this is the most efficient way to get there.
Wow. So, first you were just talking about the cultural importance of understanding this, but, part of the book, you said, or it says on the title that there's also some practice involved.
Yes.
Do you consider yourself a Pure Land practitioner after studying so long, or?
It's a tricky question. You can't study these things for 30 years without it seeping into your consciousness at some level.
Right.
I haven't formally taken refuge, but I have to say it has made a deep impression on me. Mm-hmm. And it may be precisely because I didn't really identify as a Buddhist that I was more open to this. It was the fact that it wasn't something I was seeking for my own spiritual quest. I just wanted to know what's going on in East Asian Buddhism.
Right.
And when I looked, and the other thing that's interesting is the people who did understand this was actually not the spiritual seekers or the scholars, but the missionaries. Missionaries get a really bad rap among Western Buddhists, but they were the people on the scene who were there for decades, mastered the local language, had multi-generational networks of informants, and wanted to know what the competition was. So they were very interested in having a very clear idea of the religious scene. So it was actually not the Alan Wattses or the Christmas Humphreys, nor was it the scholars who very often start out as spiritual seekers who understood how massively important Pure Land was. It was the missionaries who said, this is what everybody's doing. And especially in Japan, these are the organizations that have the biggest membership rolls, move the most money around, and own the most land.
So in this event, in I guess just a couple of weeks, besides going over some of the history and tradition, will you be sharing some practices, or are you qualified to share any Pure Land practices? What are some of the takeaways?
Well, some of the takeaways is this is not a tradition that requires you to have a qualified teacher.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can tell you what the practice is right now. Just recite the formula. If in Chinese, Namo Amitofo, or in Japanese, Namo Amida Butsu, or if you want English, homage to Amitabha Buddha. That's it. That's it. Now, depending on whether you follow Chinese or Japanese Pure Land, the way you might practice, the way you understand how it works will be very, very different. And, at the event on the 17th, I can certainly go into that. In China, it's like a backstop. It's a safety net. It means you can still do other practices, and it's good if you do, because the more you attain in this life, then the shorter the time you actually spend in the Pure Land. If you've made a head start before you die, then you don't have to be there so long. And again, if you're serious about the Mahayana vow to achieve Buddhahood for the sake of other beings, then you'll want that. So you're actually encouraged to study scriptures, do meditation, almsgiving, good deeds, all that stuff. Whereas in Japan, that is seen as irrelevant. The key terms in Pure Land Buddhism are self-power and other power. Right? So self-power is what you do for yourself. Other power is what the Buddha does for you. In China, there was always the ideal that you and the Buddha are in this together. You're cooperating. You'll get as far as you can, but he'll take you the rest of the way. Mm-hmm. So that success is still guaranteed, but it still makes a difference if you do other practices as well. Whereas in Japan, there's been a real concern to remove any notion of self-power and rely completely on the Buddha's help. And that has led to some anomalies, like, well, why should I bother doing anything then? Why not just go ahead and do whatever I want, because the Buddha's going to take me to the Pure Land anyway? And Pure Land thinkers in Japan came up with answers to that. But that problem never arose in China, because you were encouraged to exercise your own practice to whatever extent you could.
Mm-hmm. That there's a parallel to that in especially in India in the guru-disciple relationship, where there are some schools that are more, you might even say, like Hindu fundamentalists, who say you just give it up to the guru and he'll take you all the way. And then there's other schools that really rely on self-discipline and, like you said, a cooperative effort.
Yeah.
Well, what a great primer. I have to say that this concept of the Pure Land, and I guess understanding it as being some place after this life or in between incarnations where you do spiritual practice with the help of the Amitabha Buddha, who is is he the final incarnation of the Buddha, or some sort of it's referring to the same Buddha that started it all, right?
No, it's not. That's a totally different Buddha. The Buddha of our world, the historical Buddha, is named Shakyamuni.
Right.
And the Pure Land tradition generally positions them in complementary roles. Shakyamuni Buddha pushes and Amitabha Buddha pulls. Huh. So Shakyamuni is the one who preaches the sutras that tell you about the Pure Land and direct you to put that into practice. But Amitabha is a different Buddha.
Wow, okay.
He's not the same at all. The only teaching that I know of where Buddhas become one is actually in Huayan Buddhism and also in esoteric Buddhism, where all these Buddhas are aspects of Vairochana, the Buddha of the sun, who's at the center of most mandalas. But as far as Pure Land goes, see, this is the thing. You don't have to understand all that. Right, I like to compare it to flipping on a light switch. it takes an electrical engineer to design the circuitry in your house and a qualified electrician to install it. But once it's there, you don't have to know how any of it works. You just flip the switch and the light comes on.
Right,
you don't
right.
have to understand it, right? So Amitabha is the one who put in the eons of practice that really led him to become a Buddha. But he did it all along with the intention of setting up this Buddha land that other beings could come to.
What an interesting concept.
Right.
I just never heard of anything like that before, really.
Yeah.
I'm stunned. I'm stunned that there's, perhaps billions of people who all have this kind of as their spiritual culture that they're a part of, and I didn't know anything about it. It's amazing.
Well, there just wasn't that much interest in it. It didn't. Westerners who became interested in the end of the 19th century in Asian religions were generally looking for alternatives to Christianity, and they really didn't like Catholicism. So they were looking for something that wasn't dominated by priests, something that wasn't dominated by rituals, something that was free of quote unquote superstition, that would accord with science. And the successful missionaries of Buddhism and Hinduism in this country understood that, and they understood the rich paid what they wanted. So what most people learned about Buddhism, I think, is exemplified by a textbook that was very popular for many decades, Walpola Rahula's What the Buddha Taught. That presents a very sanitized, rationalized Buddhism, scrubbed clean of anything that Rahula didn't think Westerners would like. But we are coming now to know, through the scholarship of people like my good friend Robert DiCaroli, who recently published, wasn't that recent, but he published a book on just how prevalent the spirit world is, even in the Theravadan scriptures. The Buddha spends an awful lot of time dealing with tree spirits and lake dragons and preaching and performing miracles. You would never know it from the way Buddhism had been presented to Westerners. So they really didn't like Pure Land. I mean, I'm talking active hostility toward Pure Land because it just looked too much like Christianity.
I was going to say
too
that.
much like what they were trying to get away from.
Yeah.
But I think I've noticed a real sea change just in the last 10 years. I'm fascinated by what you told me, that people are coming into your bookstore now, specifically asking about Pure Land. I think 10 years ago, you wouldn't have seen that. Mm-hmm. But the Buddhist Churches of America is growing. That's a Pure Land organization. And I think more and more Western Buddhists are starting to see the sense in not putting all your trust in what you can do for yourself in one short lifetime. When one Mahayana scripture after another tells you how hard the road is, how deeply entrenched defilements are in the mind, how much hard work it takes. And when you're a working person, then that's just not realistic. So this offers a path. It may be kind of like the Phantom City in the Lotus Sutra. It's a way station. It's not a final destination, but it is the source of hope for millions of East Asian Buddhists and an increasing number of Western Buddhists.
Well, fascinating. I'm excited to learn more at your event in the coming weeks, and I do appreciate you taking the time here to kind of give us a teaser, so to speak, on this subject, and to tell us a little bit about your own life and path here. So,
okay,
thank you, Charles.
All right, it's nice talking to you.
Yeah, likewise.
Okay.